Hello everybody, and welcome to this allegorical explanation of Revelations chapter 17. For a full introduction to this series, please watch the first 10 minutes of the video for Revelation chapter 1, in which I endeavour to explain the importance of understanding the symbolic meanings hidden in these stunning sacred parables and allegories. My book, The God Design, Secrets of the Mind, Body and Soul, gives a full explanation of both the spiritual and physical scientific elements of what has become known as the sacred secretion. For this allegorical understanding, I have cross-referenced several sources and then teamed that published knowledge with my own God-led insights and understandings. As always, I would like to say that I do not profess to have all the answers. I have merely endeavoured to give the fairest and most substantiated analysis possible. Please be aware that I have a yoga app available for iOS and Android. It's called Freedom Yoga, and it's based on the teachings of the primitive Christians who were known as the Essenes. Now, I will be using the King James Version of the Bible as a point of reference, simply because it tends to be the most popular translation among Christians. I do, however, believe it necessary to say once again that the King James Version of the Bible is not original Bible text, and that many of the Bible stories themselves are not original, but rather they are evolutions of predated tales. For example, the Sumerian Great Flood. A brilliant and comprehensive timeline of how the Bible ended up in its present day form can be found at www.greatsite.com under English Bible History. As to why the Bible is written in symbolic and allegoric parables, Jesus explains in the book of Matthew, upon being asked, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" saying, "Hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desire to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it." Okay, on that incredible note, let's get started with the allegorical analysis for Revelation 17, starting with verses 1 and 2. "And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." Okay, so straight away we are seeing symbols and themes that were introduced earlier in the book of Revelations, and these themes are being carried through into this chapter. one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials or forces of the body's energy centers, which initiate chemical secretions, says, "Come hither, I will show thee the judgment or consequence of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters," which basically means, come here and I will show you the meaning of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. But who, or indeed what, is this so-called great whore? Well, further on in this chapter, verse 5 tells us the name of the whore by using 4 descriptions. 1 is mystery, 2 is Babylon, 3 is the mother of harlots, and 4 is abominations of the earth. So let's have a quick look at each of these titles. Firstly, description 1 and 2 kind of go hand in hand, mystery and Babylon, because Babylon literally is mystery and confusion. It's the cloudiness and uncertainty that robs us of our confidence, conviction, and inner peace. The third description is Mother of Harlots, also known as Jezebel. In chapter 2, we saw how metaphysically Jezebel signifies our unexalted, licentious, adulterous base instincts, or perhaps more specifically, the law propelled by the sensuality of sex. So let's just say that broadly speaking, Jezebel is synonymous with lust and promiscuity, and when our sense consciousness rules, we eventually burn ourselves out by defiling ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally. In other words, if we are not careful, we can easily be manipulated by this harlot and become enslaved to our own ego, selfishness, and subconscious addictions. Lastly, the 4th description of the whore is abominations of the earth. So here we see how our sense consciousness, or whore, affects our microcosmic body, which is signified by the earth. It's not difficult to see thousands of examples of this condition in today's society. I mean, smoking, stress, and greed spring to mind as being abominations to the body. And of course, the material plane shows us how vanity wrecks the actual earth, our planet or plane, too. Children mining for cobalt used to build cellular phones, children being trafficked for somebody else's pleasure, swathes of biodiverse rainforests being destroyed in the name of vanity. The list goes on. And in every example, there is one common denominator, which is, of course, the sense consciousness whore, being described here, who manipulates our free will and runs amok, creating chaos and devastation wherever it goes. But why does this whore sit upon many waters? Well, if we skip forward to verse 15 of this chapter, we also get a description of what waters mean in this context. The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Thus we clearly see that the waters are people, which signify thoughts, multitudes, which signify the prevailing thoughts or the vast majority of our thoughts being controlled or won over by the sense consciousness driving us to make up our mind about this or that. Then we have nations, which signify, of course, the 12 faculties of mind, which we saw in earlier chapters and are also depicted by the 12 disciples. And finally, tongues, which signify words, or indeed seeds, which are the word. In the beginning was the word. The fact that the whore, or sense consciousness, is sitting on these things shows its capacity for dominion over our soul. In verse 2, we see that the king of the earth hath committed fornication with sense consciousness. So the senses of the body, kings of the earth, philander or fool around with the whore. Or in other words, our senses don't realize what is at stake while we mess around and have fun. Verse 2 then goes on to say that the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk by the wine of her fornication, which shows how our internal organs and ductless glands are intoxicated by the way we defile our bodies. Dopamine imbalance perpetuates addiction. The release of vital fluids perpetuates lusts. It's a slippery slope or a downward spiral into addiction and self-destruction. So the breakdown for verses 1 and 2 is: one of the 7 forces stimulating chemical secretions in the energy centers showed me the consequence of the sense consciousness. The 5 physical senses are easily led by sense consciousness, and our bodies are intoxicated by the produced effects. Okay, moving on to verses 3 and 4 now. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Okay, so the force of the energy center in question here carries the higher consciousness, John, away into the wilderness, which is the place where we have space to gain perspective. In the wilderness, our higher consciousness sees a woman sat upon a scarlet, which is red, coloured beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Sound familiar? Yep. Well, that's because we've already met this so-called red beast before. It is the emotional ego, or indeed the red dragon of chapter 12, which was also labelled with the names of blasphemy and had 7 heads and 10 horns, making a reappearance. Just to quickly recap, the 7 heads, or leading powers, are fear, guilt, shame, grief, deceit, illusion, attachments or possessions, and the 10 horns signify the beast's strength and unyielding nature, like that of a bull. 10, of course, encompasses the numbers 1 and 0. Thus, it's the number of activation, an empowered unit, the seed and the ovum, or the charged ion, or the solar and lunar, or electro and magnetic combination. In verse 4, we learn that it is not only the beast that is red, but the woman is also arrayed in or wearing red and another colour, purple, which purple, of course, symbolises wealth and power, but it also has a chemical relationship with iron. For example, the presence of iron in a quartz crystal is what gives it its purple hue, thus creating what is known to us as amethyst. Furthermore, excess iron in the human body increases ferritin markers and is very damaging to our health. For example, iron deposits in the pituitary gland and testicles cause shrinkage of the testicles and impotence, and iron deposits in the heart muscles can cause cardiomyopathy and lead to heart failure as well as abnormal heart rhythms, which obviously is not a good thing. On a side note, this is another great reason to limit or cut out red meat consumption or meat consumption entirely. Now, let's have a look at the meaning of the woman wearing gold, precious stones, and pearls. Gold is an interesting symbol. In its positive representation, it's synonymous with the vivifying power of Earth's central star, aka the sun. But in its negative aspect, gold can become an idol, a material addiction that we yearn for, crave, or even compromise our values over and follow after like sheep. This parable is also given in the book of Exodus when Moses' people begin to worship the golden calf in his absence. In today's world, it is obvious that worshipping a golden calf statue will not propel or advance our social or financial status, never mind adding cubits to our stature, so to speak. We can easily see how foolish these calf worshippers were. So why is it that at certain times in our lives it's so hard for us to recognize and tame the seductive sense consciousness inside our very being? Next we have the precious stones. Once again, these highlight the whore's affiliation with vanity, materiality, lust, and perversion. The pearls are the priceless and shameless sacrifices we make or give to her in our desperation to feel her fleeting and surprisingly unfulfilling embrace. Verse 4 then goes on to say that she is holding a golden cup full of abominations and filthiness. In other words, she enjoys it. This whore, our sense consciousness, readily drinks from, or indeed feeds off of the atrocities and the delusions that she invokes. So the breakdown for verses 3 and 4 is: the force led my higher conscience to a place where there is space to gain clarity and perception. There I understood the sense consciousness and its affiliation with the emotional ego actively led by lust, insecurity, loneliness, fear, guilt, shame, grief, deceit, illusion, and attachments. The sense consciousness is lured to and tempts by power, passion, and vanity. The sense consciousness feeds off of the delusion that it invokes. Okay, verses 5 and 6 now. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs, of Jesus, and when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Okay, verse 5 has already been covered, so we'll move straight into the translation for verse 6, in which the woman is drunk with the blood of the saints. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't allude to any secret good things, but instead, once again, it highlights how the whore, or our sense consciousness, feeds off of the spirit blood of naive, innocent, and enlightened or pure beings. The further one spirals down, the more slippery the slope becomes. She is also drunk with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Means that the sense consciousness is intoxicated or blinded by the belief in something outside of itself, so much so that it becomes willing to disregard the truth in order to make a point. This whore loves the fact that humans buy into these deceptive, disempowering beliefs and becomes intoxicated, drunk on the spirit of naivety. Lastly, verse 6 says that when the higher consciousness perceived the sense consciousness, it wondered with great admiration. Now, this is due to the fact that this beast, the emotional ego, and its rider, the sense consciousness, are such a compelling sight, taste, scent, touch, and sound to behold that our higher consciousness even can easily be overcome by its beauty. So the breakdown for verses 5 and 6 is: the sense consciousness encompasses our thoughts, dominates the popular belief of what life is all about, challenges the 12 faculties of mind, and inspires what we say. The sense consciousness feeds off of innocence and naivety and is easily seduced. Okay, moving on to verses 7 and 8 now. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. Okay, in verse 4 we immediately see the force or angel who has been revealing the sense consciousness to John, our higher consciousness, coming against the seductive power of the whore and saying, Wherefore didst thou marvel? In other words, why are you so enchanted by these illusions? The angel then goes on to say that it will demystify the truth about the sense consciousness, woman, and the emotional ego, beast, that carries her, which has 7 leading powers, heads, and 10 horns, unyielding power. At this point, I feel it important to highlight another parallel with the beast's 10 horns. Now, there are 5 known pranas in Essene, primitive Christian, Hindu, and other yogic traditions. Each prana has a dual positive and negative influence on this plane. Therefore, the dual nature of each prana is equal to 10 powers in total, 5 negative, 5 positive. These pranas are also known as life winds or vital forces. And I will provide a list and description of each a little further on in this chapter. But in verse 8, the angel goes on to describe the beast, the emotional ego, in further detail. The beast that thou sawest was and is not. In other words, it's an emanation. It both exists as an illusion, was, and does not exist, is not, all at once. And it's our job to recognize this fact. Next, scripture says, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. Well, we know from previous chapters that this means the ego rising out of limitless potential, which is the bottomless pit, and has the tendency to lead our soul, our true self, towards ruin, which ruin is perdition. Then we have the line that says, and they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. Well, this was covered in chapter 13, and it means that thoughts rooted in materiality, they that dwell on the earth, will be curious, wonder, because these thoughts are not focused on the eternal truth of creation, i.e., they're not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. And lastly, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is, again, this speaks to the ever-changing possibilities of the past, present and future, as we make our choices and plant continuous seeds into the great cosmic ocean of cause and effect. In his book, Awaken the World Within, Hilton Hetema puts it like this: the beast that was, is not, and yet is a formula that expresses in an enigmatical way the Platonic doctrine that in the spheres of generation nothing really is, but all things are becoming. And that is, in the visible world, nothing partakes of permanent being, but all things are being created and destroyed, coming into existence and going into new forms. So the breakdown for verses 7 and 8 is: the force made my higher consciousness question its admiration of sense consciousness and demystified the truth of its seductive law and of the emotional ego with its 7 leading powers and unyielding strength. The emotional ego is not fixed. It rises out of limitless potential and can lead us toward ruin. Vain desires rooted in materiality will never be satisfied. They are not the unchangeable eternal truth of creation. Okay, so moving on to verses 9 to 10 now. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Okay, so in other words, verse 9 says, here is the truth. The verse then lets us know that the emotional ego's 7 heads are the 7 mountains where the woman, or sense consciousness, resides. These mountains are the obstacles or instincts described in chapter 12 that prevent us from overcoming this so-called whore. Now, for the sake of keeping this video concise, I will not list them again here. It's easy to see how emotions such as pride and envy can fuel the law of sense consciousness and materiality. Verse 10 goes on to say that there are also 7 kings. Anyone following this series will know that the book of Revelations has already presented us with 2 sets of kings, namely the 5 kings of the earth or body, which represent the 5 physical senses, and then there are the 3 kings of the east, which represent the belt stars of Orion, which also correspond with the sacred glands, the pineal, pituitary and thalamus in the microcosm. So what do these new 7 kings represent? Well, if we read on, we see that 5 of the 7 have fallen. 1 is, and the 7th will be the last. As soon as we read this, I thought of the full 7 senses of the human organism. The 5 that have fallen or materialized, sight, sound, scent, touch and taste. The one that is being, is intuition, because we're only just learning in this current era to really use it and trust it. And the 7th that will be last is telepathy, which will really set in as our species matures further and further and learns to trust their spiritual gifts and instincts. So the breakdown for 9 and 10 is, and here is the truth: the emotional ego is led by 7 obstacles to be overcome: lust, pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice and gluttony. Sense consciousness resides over these forces. There are 7 human senses. 5 we know and use. Intuition is beginning to flourish, and telepathy is yet to develop. Okay, moving on to verses 11 and 12. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Verse 11 tells us that the ever-changing emotional ego is the 8th. This 8th sense is more commonly known as the 8th consciousness, which is inferential cognition, or more traditionally known as Yogic. Verse 11 goes on to say that the 8th is of the 7. This is true because it is impossible to recognize this highly guarded 8th sense or perception without having a good awareness of the better known 7 senses and their control over us. The 8th consciousness or sense is all-encompassing awareness. Scientifically, it is known as the interoceptive system, which refers to the physiological condition of the body. Interoceptors are internal sensors that provide a sense of what we're feeling. This fact further validates its correspondence to the beast or emotional ego, because the interoceptive stimulation is detected through the nerve endings of the tree of life, which lines the respiratory and digestive mucous membranes. when what has become known as the sacred secretion is successfully preserved and raised to the crown chakra for enlightenment, it is felt as the eighth sense. It's the eighth sense that allows us to perceive the sensations that occur during those moments. The eighth sense goes into perdition or into ruin when sense consciousness rules, due to the negative effect that gluttony, addiction, envy, fear, etc. have on our temple bodies. Next, verse 12 mentions the 10 kings again. The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, as mentioned earlier, the 10 horns, which are the kings, are the unyielding dual powers of the 5 pranas. They have no kingdom because they are not joined to, fixed, or in any way confined by the material body. However, are said to receive power for 1 hour with the beast. Well, we know from previous chapters that the Jews used to calculate the hours in the day by dividing the total hours of sunlight on each given day into 12 equal parts. Therefore, the length of 1 hour varied from day to day. Consequently, an hour in this context is probably not a distinct period of time, and just means that the pranas do fluctuate according to emotion. So let's have a quick look at each of the 5 dual-natured prana or vital forces. We have Udana, which regulates the region of the body above the throat chakra or larynx. Then we have Prana, which is situated in the spinal medulla and regulates the region between the larynx and the base of the heart. Then we have Samana, which regulates the region of the body from the heart to the navel. And Apana, which regulates the automatic action of the kidneys, colon, rectum, bladder and genitals. And lastly, Vayana penetrates the entire body and governs movement. So the breakdown for verses 11 and 12 is: the ever-changing emotional ego corresponds with the 8th sense, inferential cognition, and may lead us into ruin. The 10 unyielding powers are 10 vital forces which are not governed by the physical body. However, they do fluctuate according to the emotional ego. Okay, moving on to verses 13 and 14 now. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Okay, the 10 kings, vital forces, have one mind. In other words, although the vital forces vary, they are the same in essence, and they influence the emotional ego, so they give strength unto the beast. Then verse 14 says that the vital forces which influence the emotional ego, these make war with the Lamb, or in other words, they challenge Christ consciousness, Lamb consciousness, because the Lamb is Christ, which is also synonymous with lamp and thalamus, the light of consciousness. But thankfully, Christ consciousness overcomes the emotional ego and its influences, For he, Christ, is Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Meaning the Christ substance or divine consciousness is the light above all lights, the creative gold or ore in the through and in and through all things, and it supersedes all other leaders, King of Kings, and anyone who understands this and lives obediently because they know what it means to live in the stream of grace. So the breakdown for verses 13 and 14 is: although the vital forces vary, they are the same in essence and collectively influence the emotional ego. The emotional ego and its influencer challenge Christ consciousness. But the truth prevails, for the divine substance is the pure light, the all-powerful leader, and those who understand this are loyal. Okay, verses 15 and 16 now. And he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And then the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Okay, let's head straight to the breakdown for these verses, as much of this symbolism has already been explained in previous videos. So the breakdown for verses 15 and 16 is: Christ consciousness showed me that sense consciousness resides over the cerebrospinal fluid ventricles of the brain, where thought, judgments that infer decision making, the faculties of mind, and the words we use to speak creative spells over ourselves and others, knowingly or unknowingly initiate. The 5 vital forces which influence the emotional ego will come to despise the sense consciousness, expose it, and strip it of power, and atone it by the spirit of truth. Okay, so verses 17 and 18 now. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Okay, this last part is lovely, and it's actually fairly straightforward. The one creator of all gave us an inner compass which longs to be good and do good, God, the heart to fulfill his will, and the desire to surrender ourselves to debilitating attachments of the emotional ego. So give their kingdom unto the beast, until love prevails, or until the words and intentions of goodness, God, shall be fulfilled. And finally, verse 18, broken down into small sections, goes as follows. And the woman which thou saw, and the sense consciousness, is that great city, so an aggregate of thought or false paradigm, collective consciousness, which reign over the kings of the earth, so which has dominion over the 5 physical senses. So the breakdown for verses 17 and 18 is: our loving Creator has given us the desire to be loving and surrender our attachment to material illusions until love prevails over all. The sense consciousness is a false paradigm which has dominion over the five senses. And as always, I will just quickly do a breakdown for all of the verses in this chapter. One of the seven forces stimulating chemical secretions in the energy centers showed me the consequences of the sense consciousness. The five physical senses are easily led by sense consciousness, and our bodies are intoxicated by the produced effects. The force led my higher conscience to a place where there is space to gain clarity and perception. There I understood the sense consciousness and its affiliation with the emotional ego, actively led by lust, insecurity, loneliness, fear, guilt, shame, grief, deceit, illusion, and attachments. The sense consciousness is lured to and tempts by power, passion, and vanity. The sense consciousness feeds off of the delusion that it invokes. The sense consciousness encompasses our thoughts, dominates the popular belief of what life is all about, challenges the 12 faculties of mind, and inspires what we say. The sense consciousness feeds off of innocence and naivety and is easily seduced. The force gave my higher consciousness to question its admiration of sense consciousness and demystified the truth of its seductive lure, and of the emotional ego with its 7 leading powers and unyielding strength. The emotional ego is not fixed. It rises out of limitless potential and can lead us toward ruin. Vain desires rooted in materiality will never be satisfied. They are not the unchangeable eternal truth of creation. And here is the truth. The emotional ego is led by 7 obstacles to be overcome: lust, pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, and gluttony. Sense consciousness resides over these forces. There are 7 human senses. 5 we know and use. Intuition is beginning to flourish, and telepathy is yet to develop. The ever-changing emotional ego corresponds with the 8th sense, inferential cognition, and may lead us into ruin. The 10 unyielding powers are 10 vital forces which are not governed by the physical body. However, they do fluctuate according to the emotional ego. Although the vital forces vary, they are the same in essence and collectively influence the emotional ego. The emotional ego and its influencer challenge Christ consciousness, but the truth prevails, for the divine substance is the pure light, the all-powerful leader, and those who understand this are loyal. Christ consciousness showed me that sense consciousness resides over the cerebrospinal fluid ventricles of the brain, where thought, judgments that infer decision-making, the faculties of mind, and the words we use to speak creative spells over ourselves and others knowingly or unknowingly initiate. The 5 vital forces which influence the emotional ego will come to despise the sense consciousness, expose it, and strip it of power, and atone it by the truth of spirit. Our loving Creator has given us the desire to be loving and surrender our attachment to material illusions until love prevails over all. The sense consciousness is a false paradigm which has dominion over the 5 senses. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this allegorical study of Revelation chapter 17. Special thanks to all of my patrons, specifically Cindy Jewel, whose generosity is a massive blessing. Here are all of the links to my social media and to buy my book. The research, writing and making of these videos does of course take me a lot of time and does of course cost money, so if you would like to support by Patreon or by buying a t-shirt from my website or below this video, I would of course be very grateful. As I said at the beginning, I do have an app available in the App Store and in the Google Play Store called Freedom Yoga. It's based on the teachings of the primitive Christians known as the Essenes, and it's fully customizable, so you can choose the length and style of your yoga practice, and there are free and pro versions available there as well. So thanks again for watching. I hope you're all very well. It's obviously been a challenging year for most of us in many different ways. We are growing and adapting at a very expedited rate at the moment, which is obviously quite intriguing and can be quite difficult, but also enjoyable to know that often crises such as these are part of a much bigger plan for something wonderful to be made way for. So hopefully, well, I'm sure that is the case. Anyway, thank you once again for watching. Peace and light, as always.